Some people walk into a room and immediately sense something others do not notice at all. A heavy silence, a sadness hidden behind a smile, a vague tension that no one names. If you are that kind of person, chances are you are used to becoming the place where others pour out their thoughts, used to listening, understanding, and sometimes carrying emotions that were never yours to begin with. But after many years of living this way, a question begins to arise in the hearts of many empaths. Why does empathy, something once seen as a gift, sometimes leave us feeling so deeply exhausted? From Carl Jung's perspective, that question is not a sign of weakness. On the contrary, it is often the sign that a process of awakening has begun. For many empaths, the journey of growth does not lie in feeling more or sacrificing more. It lies in beginning to understand their own sensitivity. When that happens, empathy is no longer an open wound, but gradually becomes a deeper form of awareness about human beings and the world. If you have ever felt that you might be walking through such a journey, stay with this video until the end. Because what an empath truly becomes after awakening may be very different from what the world usually says. 1. The empath before awakening. The eyes of a sensitive person sometimes see far more than what is spoken aloud. In a room full of people, some are laughing, some are talking, everything appears completely normal, yet somewhere in that room, there is someone quietly sensing the invisible currents of emotion moving through the air. They notice when someone's voice becomes slightly more tense than usual, when a passing glance carries unspoken meaning, when the silence of someone in the group holds a sadness that others fail to see. People like this are often called empaths. For many years, society has romanticized that image as if it were the mark of a special soul, a rare gift of deep compassion. But when we look more closely at the journey of empaths before they truly awaken, a different picture begins to appear. Not the picture of a purely innate gift, but a far more complex story about how human beings learn to feel others, to survive in a world that is not always safe. And it is here that a quiet question begins to surface. What if that powerful ability to sense emotions did not begin with psychological maturity, but with the need for survival? In the psychology of Carl Jung, human beings are shaped not only by what they consciously know about themselves, but also by invisible forces living deep within the unconscious. Early life experiences, especially within the family environment, often leave impressions so strong that they become the foundation for how we see the world and how we relate to others. One of Jung's well-known reflections touches the heart of this idea. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That sentence opens an entirely new way of understanding the empath. Many people believe they were simply born sensitive. They remember how, even as children, they could easily sense the emotions of others. They were the understanding ones, the ones who knew when to stay quiet and when to say something that would soften the atmosphere. But Jung would ask a deeper and less comfortable question. Under what circumstances did that ability develop? And what made it grow so strong? To understand that, we have to return to a very familiar place, yet often overlooked: childhood. Imagine a child growing up in a home where the emotional atmosphere constantly shifts. There may not always be shouting or arguments, but tension lingers in the air. Some days, just looking at the faces of the adults in the house tells the child that silence is the safest choice. Some evenings, A single sentence spoken at the wrong moment can cause everything to erupt. In environments like this, children learn very quickly, not through direct instruction, but through observation. They learn to watch their parents' eyes to guess their moods. They listen carefully to tones of voice to detect signs of anger or exhaustion. They read the atmosphere of the house as if it were an invisible emotional map. Gradually, that child becomes very skilled at reading emotions. But the important point is that this ability does not arise from inner freedom. It arises from the need to protect oneself. When a child cannot control the environment around them, the only thing they can do is learn to predict it. Here, a deeper layer of meaning begins to emerge. Empaths, before awakening, often do not develop their sensitivity in peaceful environments. Instead, they grow up in situations where reading the emotions of others becomes necessary to avoid conflict, avoid being scolded, avoid abandonment, or simply to keep everything from falling apart. Over time, this creates a very particular psychological adaptation. The child learns to place other people's feelings ahead of their own. They become the mediator when parents argue. They try to make people laugh when the atmosphere in the house grows heavy. They become the understanding one, the one who does not cause trouble, the one who tries to keep everything stable. In modern psychology, this phenomenon is often described as people-pleasing or emotional caretaking. A person begins to feel that their value is tied to their ability to soothe the emotions of others. They do not simply want to help people. They feel responsible for doing so. Gradually, the boundary between compassion and emotional obligation begins to blur. When someone grows up in the role of the peacemaker and emotional stabilizer, they rarely realize that an important part of themselves has been left behind. They learn to understand others because no one truly understands them. They learn to carry other people's emotions because, without doing so, the relationships around them might become unstable. Over time, they begin to believe that this is who they truly are. Carl Jung saw this phenomenon very differently. He believed that human beings develop what he called a persona, a psychological mask that helps us adapt to the world. The persona is not inherently bad. It is simply the role we learn to play to function in society. But when a person completely identifies with their persona, they may forget the deeper essence of who they are. For many empaths, that persona becomes the image of the one who always understands, always remains gentle, always carries the emotional weight of others. Seen from this perspective, another truth becomes clearer. The foundation of the empath is not only compassion, it is also a wound. This does not make their empathy any less valuable. On the contrary, it helps explain why that empathy is so powerful. But it also reverses a popular belief that the more deeply someone feels, the more spiritually evolved they must be. Reality is often more complex. The ability to feel deeply can be both a gift and the trace of something that has not yet healed. At this very intersection, the journey of an empath begins to enter its most important stage. Because when someone begins to see the origin of their sensitivity, they are no longer just the person who absorbs the emotions of an entire room. They begin asking new questions, and those questions can completely change the way they see themselves. If you recognize part of yourself in these lines, stay with me, because the next section will reveal a psychological turning point that very few empaths are ever prepared to face. 2. The myth of the chosen empath. In recent years, across countless self-development books, spiritual communities online, and conversations among people searching for meaning in their pain, a familiar narrative keeps appearing. Empaths are the chosen ones. They are described with luminous labels, such as old souls, light workers, or healers with a mission. In these stories, empaths are not simply sensitive people. They are portrayed as souls who came here to make the world gentler. And if you have spent years feeling out of place, feeling different from those around you, constantly overwhelmed by the emotions of others, the idea that you are special can bring an immense sense of comfort. In that moment, your pain suddenly seems meaningful. Instead of believing you are too sensitive, too fragile, or too difficult to integrate into the world, you can believe that you are simply different. And that difference is not a weakness, it is a gift. But here, an important question must be asked. What if the story of the chosen empath is only half the truth, while the other half lies somewhere many people do not want to look? Carl Jung offered a profound observation about how human beings deal with the parts of themselves they do not fully understand. In one of his reflections on the psyche, he noted that the mind often creates noble symbols to cover what we are not yet ready to face. A sentence often cited in discussions about this reads, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." That statement is not meant as judgment. It is more like a gentle reminder that human beings sometimes create beautiful stories to avoid confronting deeper pain. And for many empaths, the myth of being chosen can sometimes function as a protective shell. This does not mean that an empath's sensitivity is fake. The issue lies in how we interpret its origin. In many spiritual communities, emotional sensitivity is described as a rare ability. Empaths are encouraged to believe they are here to heal the world. They are told to keep their hearts open, to keep giving, to maintain their gentleness, even when the world becomes harsh. Those messages sound beautiful, and to some degree they contain truth. But at a deeper level, they can also create a subtle problem. When someone believes their sensitivity is a sacred gift, they may stop asking questions about where it came from. Yet those questions are exactly where real healing begins. Among many stories about empaths, I remember a woman named Jane. She shared her story with me during a long conversation after she had watched a video about Jungian psychology that stirred something inside her. For many years, Jane believed she was an empath in the spiritual sense. She read countless books about light workers. She joined communities where people reassured each other that their sensitivity was the mark of an old soul. At first, that belief brought her relief. It explained why relationships often overwhelmed her. It explained why she felt responsible for the emotional well-being of those around her. And it explained why she was always the one who stayed behind to help when someone else was falling apart. But after many years living in that role, Jane began to notice something confusing. Despite constantly trying to heal others, her own life remained exhausting. She often felt drained after long conversations with friends. She felt guilty whenever she wanted to say no, and she realized she had almost no idea how to set boundaries. This was the moment when the story began to change. During a therapy session, Jane told her therapist that she believed she had been born to heal others. The therapist did not argue with her. Instead, he asked a simple question: if you did not heal anyone at all, who would you be? Jane sat in silence for a long time, because for the first time, she realized that her entire identity had been built around helping others feel better. Here, Jung's theory offers a powerful insight. Jung believed that people often develop a persona, a psychological role that helps them adapt to their environment. The persona is not false. It is simply the mask we learn to wear to function socially. But when the persona becomes the whole identity of a person, they can lose contact with their deeper self. In Jane's case, that persona was the healer. It made her loved. It made people turn to her in times of pain. But it also made her believe that her worth depended on making others feel better. And this is exactly where the spiritual myth can unintentionally delay real healing. When a survival mechanism is labeled as something sacred, people feel less motivation to examine it. If Jane believed she was born to carry the emotional weight of others, she would ask fewer questions about why she felt guilty prioritizing herself. If she believed her sensitivity was a mission, she might continue sacrificing herself without realizing how exhausted she had become. Behind this lies an even deeper insight. In Jungian psychology, true inner growth does not begin with praise or glorification. It begins with seeing the truth about oneself, including the uncomfortable parts. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming one's true self by confronting both light and shadow. This means empaths do not need to be glorified as special souls to have value. What they truly need is to understand the origin of their sensitivity. When an empath realizes that their ability to read emotions once served as a way to survive emotionally complex environments, they can begin to look at themselves with genuine compassion rather than romantic myths. At that exact moment, a new door begins to open, because when an empath no longer needs to believe they are chosen, they can begin to become something far more powerful, a free human being. And interestingly, as the myth of the chosen empath begins to dissolve, an even deeper truth about the empath's nature slowly begins to reveal itself in the next part.
Look at the projections. They look solid.
3. Awakening begins with disillusionment. Awakening is often imagined as a radiant moment, as though one day everything suddenly becomes clear, lighter, and full of hope. But in real psychological life, especially for empaths who are beginning the journey of understanding themselves more deeply, awakening rarely arrives as a gentle light. More often it comes like a profound disillusionment, not loud, but deep enough to shake what once seemed obvious. And what makes that moment hardest to accept is that it not only changes the way we see others, but also the way we see ourselves. But what many empaths are not prepared for is this. The process of awakening rarely begins with enlightenment. More often, it begins with the collapse of old stories. At some point, usually after many years of living as the understanding one, the empath begins to look back at their relationships with different eyes. What was once called closeness begins to feel more complicated. Relationships once seen as deep start, revealing quiet absences, and a question begins to arise, first only as a passing thought, but gradually becoming clearer. Why is it that in so many relationships, I am always the one giving more? That question may come after a conversation that leaves you exhausted. After a moment, you realize the other person has never truly asked how you are feeling. Or after something very simple, when you notice that if you stop being the one who keeps the connection alive, Some relationships may quietly disappear. Right here, a deeper layer of awareness begins to unfold. The empath gradually realizes that many of their relationships were built on a very particular foundation: self-abandonment. In those relationships, they are the understanding ones, the one with no needs, the one who forgives the fastest, the one willing to listen for hours, the one who absorbs other people's difficult emotions, keeps the atmosphere around them stable. At first glance, those qualities look like compassion, and in many cases, they truly do come from kindness. But when the empath looks more closely, they begin to realize that part of this behavior is driven by something deeper and more complex. Empaths are not always kind because they simply want to be. Sometimes they are kind because they fear rejection. They are not always tolerant because they are strong. Sometimes they are tolerant because they fear conflict. They are not always ready to help because they overflow with loving energy. Sometimes they do it because deep in the unconscious, they believe that if they do not keep everything stable, the connection will disappear. One Jungian insight touches this point very deeply. In his reflections on human maturity, Jung emphasizes that true growth does not come from becoming morally better, but from seeing the unconscious motives behind our behavior. One of his most quoted lines about this says, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That line feels like a gentle but demanding invitation, because it suggests that awakening is not about imagining ourselves as brighter, better, or more noble beings. It is about daring to look at the parts of ourselves we once did not want to see. From here, the process of disillusionment begins to grow painful. Because when the empath looks back at behaviors once seen as compassion, they begin to realize that part of them was actually a trauma response. They remember the times they said, "It's okay," when in truth they were exhausted inside. They remember the times they forgave too quickly to avoid a difficult conversation. They remember the times they stayed in relationships that, deep down, their heart already knew were unhealthy. In that moment, many empaths go through a very strange feeling. It is not fully anger, nor is it exactly sadness. It feels more like realizing that part of your life was built around a role you were never fully conscious of. And what makes it hardest to accept is this: that role had once been mistaken for your true self. In Greek mythology, there is the story of Cassandra, the woman gifted with the ability to see the future, yet cursed so that no one would believe her warnings. Cassandra is often used as a symbol of knowledge accompanied by loneliness. But from a psychological perspective, Cassandra can also symbolize another kind of moment. The moment when someone begins to see a truth they had never seen before. Empaths in the awakening process sometimes go through a similar state. When they begin to recognize the real motives behind so many of their behaviors, they do not just see the world differently, they see themselves differently. What was once called personality suddenly appears as an adaptive pattern. What was once called unconditional kindness begins to reveal layers of need that had never been spoken aloud. Many empaths describe this stage as feeling lost inside their own lives. When the old role begins to collapse, they no longer know who they are if they are not the one who is always helping everyone. At times, the feeling resembles mild depression, not because life has become worse, but because the old identity is dissolving. In Jungian psychology, this stage is a natural part of the process of individuation. When the persona, the social mask we once used to survive, begins to lose its power, people often go through a period of confusion. Jung saw this as a necessary step in the journey of inner growth, because only when the persona begins to dissolve does the deeper self finally have a chance to emerge. This leads to the hardest question many empaths must face. If you are no longer the one who is always there for everyone, if you are no longer the one who absorbs the emotions of the whole room, if you are no longer the one who keeps the peace in every relationship, then who are you? That question can frighten many people. But in Jungian psychology, it is precisely the question that opens the path to freedom. Because when you begin to ask it, you are no longer living entirely inside the old role. And when that happens, the journey of an empath enters an entirely different phase. If these lines made you see yourself somewhere in this story, in the exhaustion, in the moments of giving too much, or in the quiet turning point where you begin to look back at yourself, take a second to like and share this video. There may be many others out there just like you, moving through a silent awakening without yet knowing how to name it. And sometimes, simply knowing you are not alone can make the journey feel much lighter. 4. The death of the helper. The biggest changes in inner life rarely feel like victories. More often they feel like losses. Not the loss of a relationship or a circumstance, but the loss of a part of identity we once believed was our true self. For many empaths, that moment arrives when they begin to realize that their familiar role, the one who always helps, the one who always understands, the one who is always there for everyone, can no longer continue in the same way. And what makes this moment so difficult to accept is not that it is wrong, but that it once made life feel meaningful. And yet, in the very place that seems like loss, an important turning point in the awakening process begins to appear. For many years, even decades, countless empaths have built their sense of worth around being needed by others. They do not simply want to help. They feel they must help. When someone is suffering, they stay and listen. When someone is lost, they try to guide them. When a relationship becomes complicated, they are the one trying to understand both sides. And deep inside, a quiet belief begins to form. If I am patient enough, compassionate enough, understanding enough, the other person will eventually change. That belief is not naive. It comes from real compassion, but over time, it also becomes an invisible burden. Because when someone places their entire identity in rescuing others, they rarely realize that they are neglecting an important part of themselves. An uncomfortable truth begins to emerge, even if at first it appears only as a vague feeling. The pain an empath absorbs does not disappear. It does not dissolve into the air the way they once hoped. It simply changes location. From other people's lives, it quietly moves into their own body and mind. At first, this shows up as fatigue, a kind of exhaustion that is hard to explain after long conversations. Later, it may become prolonged nervous tension, restless nights, headaches, stomach pain, or simply a sense of emptiness with no clear cause. The empath may continue helping others, but inside they begin to feel like a vessel that has been filled with too much water. But this is only the surface layer of the story. Because when the empath pauses and looks deeper, they begin to realize that the impulse to help does not come from compassion alone. It is also connected to something deeper in the human psyche. In Jungian psychology, every human being carries within them something called the shadow. The shadow is not the evil part of us. It is simply the aspects of ourselves that we have not yet recognized or accepted. And sometimes even the most beautiful human qualities come with a shadow of their own. A profound insight found throughout Jung's work expresses this clearly. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The idea here is subtle. Inner growth does not come from trying to become better through idealization, but from seeing the unconscious motives hidden beneath our behavior. When empaths begin to look at the shadow side of their compassion, they often discover something that surprises them. Behind the desire to help others, there is sometimes a deeply human need. The need to be needed. When someone needs you, you feel meaningful. When someone depends on you, you feel important. And in many cases, that feeling of being needed has become the foundation of identity. This does not make an empath's kindness fake. It simply shows that kindness is woven together with the deeper needs of the human soul. But once this becomes clear, a major shift begins to happen. The empath starts to understand that they cannot heal others by sacrificing themselves. This is not a rejection of compassion. It is a maturation of compassion. Imagine a small river flowing through a valley. For many years, that river has tried to carry everything that falls into it: broken branches, dry leaves, rocks, and soil from the banks. At first, it keeps flowing. But if too much is pulled into the current, the river gradually becomes heavier, slower, and eventually may become blocked. Many empaths live like that river. They try to carry the pain of others, hoping that in doing so, they can soften the lives around them. But a river can keep flowing only if it is allowed to let go of what does not belong to it. At the moment the empath realizes this, the helper begins to die. Not death in a negative sense. It is the death of an old role. The death of the belief that one's worth lies in always being ready to rescue. At first, this change may make the empath feel guilty. They may wonder if they are becoming selfish. They may fear that if they stop always being there for others, they will lose important connections. But from Jung's point of view, this is precisely a necessary step in individuation, the journey of becoming one's true self. Individuation is not the abandonment of care for others. It is the building of an identity that does not depend entirely on the role of rescuer. Helping others can be a beautiful part of life, but it cannot be the entire foundation of personal identity. A human being cannot exist only by reacting to the needs of others. They need an inner center of their own, a place where their value does not depend on whether or not they are needed. When the empath begins to accept this, the old helper slowly dissolves. But in its place, another version of them begins to form, a version that still carries compassion, but no longer carries the full weight of the world's pain. And the fascinating part is that when that old role truly comes to an end, a deeper transformation of the empath begins to reveal itself. If you want to understand what that new version really looks like,
I can't
stay with
handle
me,
this.
because what happens next in the journey of an empath is often
so
even more
much easier
surprising.
online.
5. The empath after awakening. The change in an empath after awakening is rarely loud. There is no dramatic burst of light, no sense of becoming a better version in any easy or pleasant way. The people who once knew them may notice only something very subtle. They become quieter, less reactive, and somehow harder to reach than before. But beneath that quietness, an entirely different psychological structure has begun to form. And what makes this transformation so striking is that it does not make the empath cold. It simply makes them clearer about who they are. But what surprises many people is this. The empath after awakening often no longer resembles the image of the empath the world once knew. For many years, the familiar image of the empath has been someone who always keeps their heart open, always listens, always shows up when others need them. They are the one who can feel the emotions of the entire room and immediately tries to soothe the atmosphere. But when the true process of awakening begins, something subtle happens. The empath realizes that their emotional energy is not an infinite resource. From that awareness, the first shift appears. The empath after awakening becomes extremely selective. Not because they no longer care about others, but because they begin to understand the value of their time and energy. Before, they might have opened themselves to almost anyone who was suffering. They felt responsible for listening, helping, and trying to understand. But after going through disillusionment and seeing their old patterns clearly, they begin asking different questions. Who is truly willing to take responsibility for their own life? Who is only looking for a place to unload their emotions? And who is using their compassion as a free source of emotional energy? The empath after awakening no longer invests emotionally without discernment. They begin observing more carefully before opening their heart. This may make others feel that they have changed, even become distant. But what is really happening is a process of inner maturity. In the years before awakening, empaths often avoided conflict. They tried to keep the peace, tried to understand every point of view, tried to say things that would make others feel comfortable. But as the process of individuation that Jung described begins to unfold, the empath gradually realizes that artificial harmony is not always healthy. One reflection found in Jung's work touches this point very deeply. Where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, love is lacking. This idea reveals something subtle about the human psyche. Real love does not need to manipulate or control. And when a person begins to recognize the hidden power dynamics inside relationships, they also begin to change the way they respond. That is why the empath after awakening becomes more direct. They learn to speak the truth, even when that truth is not easy to hear. They begin to set clearer boundaries. They ask others to take responsibility instead of silently carrying everyone's difficult emotions. In Jungian psychology, this change is often connected to the integration of the aggressive shadow. Aggression here does not mean violent or hostile. It simply means the ability to assert oneself, the ability to say no, the ability to protect one's own psychological space. Before, this part was often repressed by the empath because they feared hurting others. But as the shadow begins to integrate, the empath understands that directness is also a form of honesty with oneself. Still, this is not yet the most significant change. One of the deepest transformations happens when the empath learns a skill they had never truly known how to practice before. They learn how to feel without carrying. The empath still feels the pain of others. That ability does not disappear. They can still hear sadness in a friend's voice or sense heaviness in the atmosphere of a room. But unlike before, they no longer see those emotions as their task to solve. This can be understood as a movement from identification to observation. Before, the empath easily dissolved into the emotions of others. But after awakening, they begin to hold an inner distance. They can feel another person's pain without allowing that pain to take over their entire nervous system. The empath realizes that compassion is not about carrying the weight of the world on one's shoulders. True compassion is the ability to see another person's pain while still respecting their journey. But this change often brings another consequence, and this is something many empaths find uncomfortable at first. In the past, they often tried to control how others perceived them. They wanted to be seen as the good one, the understanding one, the one who was always available. So they explained more, apologized more, and tried to avoid situations that might disappoint others. After going through the process of self-reflection, the empath gradually understands that trying to control how others interpret them is an impossible task. They state their point of view clearly. They set boundaries when necessary, and they accept that not everyone will agree with them. This does not make them cold. It simply makes them more honest. And it is precisely that honesty that creates a very interesting effect in the environment around them. The empath, after awakening, becomes dangerous to toxic systems. Not dangerous in a negative sense. Dangerous in the sense that they are no longer easily manipulated. Before, people with controlling or emotionally manipulative tendencies could easily lean on the empath's compassion. They knew the empath would try to understand, try to forgive, and try to keep the peace. But after awakening, the empath begins to recognize those patterns much more quickly. They notice the falseness in insincere apologies. They recognize the ways some people shift emotional responsibility onto others. And more importantly, they no longer feel compelled to fix those things. This makes toxic systems harder to sustain than before. When one person no longer plays the role of absorbing all the tension for the group, the old structure begins to change. But there is a paradox here. The empath after awakening sometimes feels lonelier in the beginning. Because many old relationships were built around the previous version of the empath, the version who was always ready to carry the weight. When that version no longer exists, some connections also begin to change. But from Jung's perspective, this is not a true loss. It is a natural part of individuation. When a person becomes more honest with themselves, they may lose relationships that no longer fit. But they also open the possibility of building more genuine connections. When the empath truly enters this stage, they begin to become something entirely different from what they once imagined. They are no longer the one who always carries the emotions of the world, but they also do not become cold or distant. Instead, they become someone capable of feeling deeply while still remaining rooted in their own inner center. 6. Individuated empath, the destination of transformation. Something interesting often happens when an empath begins to change the reaction of the world around them. Not everyone is happy to see them grow. In fact, in many cases, that change makes other people uncomfortable. Because the earlier version of the empath was very easy to be around. They always listened, always showed up, always forgave faster than anyone else. They rarely asked for anything, and because of that, being close to them was easy. But as the process of inner transformation begins to complete itself, A different version of the empath gradually appears, and this version no longer resembles the old one. The old version was very pleasant. That person was willing to stay through conversations that lasted for hours. They understood every reason, every circumstance, every weakness in others. They rarely asked for anything in return. In many relationships, the empath's presence was like an emotional buffer, a place where tension was absorbed and mistakes were quickly forgiven. But when the empath enters a more mature stage of the inner journey, this begins to change. The empath after transformation does not become less loving, but they become clearer about how they love. They begin to ask for honesty in relationships. They begin to expect respect. And more importantly, they begin to understand that a healthy relationship requires reciprocity. To those who are used to receiving without giving back, this change may look like selfishness. Some people will say the empath has changed. Some will feel they have become colder. But in truth, something entirely different is happening. What is forming is a healthy boundary. In Jungian psychology, the deepest process of human growth is called individuation. This is the journey through which a person gradually integrates the different parts of themselves, persona, shadow, emotion, and reason to become a more whole individual. Individuation does not strip a person of their sensitivity. On the contrary, it helps them use that sensitivity consciously. One reflection in Jung's work expresses this beautifully. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. That line points to something very profound. Becoming yourself does not mean clinging to the old roles you once used to survive. It means discovering your true nature behind those roles. To understand this more clearly, consider the story of Abigail. Abigail said that for most of her life, she was always seen as the strong one. She was the person her friends turned to in crisis. She was the one who could listen to painful stories without judgment. In her family, she was often the one standing in the middle of conflicts, trying to keep the peace. For many years, Abigail believed this was who she truly was. She felt proud of her ability to understand others. But over time, she began to realize something that confused her. Even though she was always there for everyone, she often felt lonely. The deep conversations she gave to others rarely returned in the other direction. Abigail came to realize that many of her relationships were built around a very familiar structure. She was the giver, and the other person was the receiver. This was not because anyone was intentionally exploiting her. It simply happened because she was always willing to take on that role. Through therapy and self-observation, Abigail began to understand what Jung called identification with the persona. Her persona was the caregiver. It made her loved, trusted, and seen as dependable. But it also made it difficult for her to recognize that she, too, had needs. And when that persona began to be seen clearly, a profound transformation began. Abigail did not become a different person, but she began to change the way she showed up in relationships. She started speaking honestly when she felt tired. She began refusing requests that left her depleted. And most importantly, she began to realize that her worth did not depend on whether other people needed her. At first, this change confused some people in her life. Some said she had become different. But over time, Abigail realized that truly deep relationships did not disappear. They simply changed form. And it is here that an important truth about the mature empath becomes clear. The empath after individuation does not lose their sensitivity. They still notice subtle things that others miss. They still can see the pain beneath another person's behavior, but their relationship to that ability has changed. Before, sensitivity felt like an open wound. Every emotion from another person could strike directly into their nervous system. But after the transformation, sensitivity becomes a tool of perception. And this creates a very important difference. The mature empath can feel another person's sorrow without being swallowed by it. They can love without sacrificing themselves. They can connect deeply without losing their boundaries. In Jungian psychology, this is the sign of an identity that has become more whole. When the shadow is integrated, the persona is seen, and unconscious needs are recognized, a person no longer needs to prove their worth through self-sacrifice. And it is exactly at this point that the empath truly becomes a free individual. They no longer live to prove that they are kind. They no longer try to become a container for the emotional weight of the whole world. Instead, they live as a whole human being with the capacity to feel deeply, but also with inner clarity. The awakening journey of an empath is not about becoming better in the ordinary sense. It is the process of letting go of a familiar identity, facing deep wounds, and learning how to exist without needing to rescue everyone around them. The growth of the empath does not lie in feeling more or sacrificing more, but in the shift from unconscious emotion to conscious awareness. At that point, sensitivity is no longer a burden. It becomes an ability that helps them understand people and the world with greater clarity. An awakened empath is not a more perfect version of the old self. They are different people altogether, more genuine, clearer in their boundaries, and freer in the way they love. If these reflections helped you recognize part of your own journey, take a moment to like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what comes next. The journey of understanding yourself still holds so much more to discover, and we will continue going deeper together in the videos ahead.